Hello, everybody. My name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am doing this presentation for New Covenant United Reformed Church of Twin Falls, Idaho. We're at 1306 Filer Avenue East for anyone who is interested. And this presentation is probably going to be in 4 parts as I have it planned now. What transpires is, of course, in God's hands, but that's the plan for now. And we're going to be talking about the Apocrypha and also in the context of common Protestant errors regarding the Apocrypha. And the reason why we're doing this is that this subject has actually come up in our teaching services a few times, not a ton, but it's come up a few times. And in our teaching services, we unfortunately don't usually have enough time to really get into some of these details. When it comes to the issue of the Apocrypha and what is canonical and what isn't and those kinds of things, theories of canon and all that, it's really hard to answer a question of that nature, in 2 to 5 minutes, which is usually the time frame that we're working with in the teaching service. And so for people who want to go into greater detail on those kinds of things, we are going to try to put out this series for people that want kind of the deeper background, as it were. And the reason why we're taking a look at it from the perspective of common Protestant errors is because we, especially as Reformed Christians in particular, believe that there are ways to deal with various subjects that glorify God and ways to deal with subjects that do not glorify God. In particular, when we're dealing with issues of controversy in the church and things that distinguish us from other groups, one of the things that we would say most glorifies God is when we deal with these kinds of things very carefully, very diligently, very accurately. And unfortunately, the Apocrypha is an area where Protestants in general, evangelicals in general, a lot of groups that would call themselves, Bible-believing Christians, sometimes we don't deal with this area very accurately. And we believe that inaccuracy dishonors God. Now, to be perfectly clear about this, I am very much so a Reformed Protestant. The church that I am doing this for is very much so Reformed Protestant. We very much so do not believe that the Apocrypha is canonical. But we also want to make sure that our reasons for believing that are good, solid reasons, and that they're not based on, historical falsehoods or outright lies or just misconceptions. So, yes, we're typical Protestants in that regard, totally and completely, but we don't want to make the mistake of thinking errantly about this subject. And that's why we're going into detail on it, and that's also why I want to break it into 4 parts so that it's a little bit easier to digest for people. So this will come out fairly slowly. It'll take a while to put all these presentations together, but to give you an overview of what we're doing, first time, this presentation, we're going to be talking about just the general question of what is the Apocrypha. How do we define it? Where did that word come from? When was it put in Bibles? When was it not put in Bibles? Things like that. Lord willing, next time, provided this one goes well, we're going to talk about some of the poor reasons to reject the ecclesiasticals that are out there. That is, there's a lot of Protestants out there, a lot of evangelicals out there, Pentecostals out there, people that would call themselves Bible-believing Christians that come up with some really interesting reasons why they believe that the Apocrypha should be rejected as canonical. And I'm using the alternate term ecclesiasticals here, but for our intents and purposes, I'll explain it a little bit more later, but for our intents and purposes now, it's basically the same as the Apocrypha. Technically, it's a little bit broader category, but when I say that, just think Apocrypha for now. But we're going to talk about some of the reasons that are given out there that are actually not all that solid, that are not actually particularly valid reasons, and we'll talk about why not. Then we're going to kind of address the big elephant in the room, and that is what actually makes a book canonical. Okay, if there are some reasons that are out there that aren't so good, well, on what basis would we say that something is canonical? Now, I already have a presentation that is out on this, and it's actually on the the church YouTube channel already, and I don't want to rehash everything that I did in that one just because for people who already watched it, that would be really redundant. And so I'm going to give a kind of a brief overview of what I said in that other video and focus more so on kind of the 30,000 foot view of this question. In that other video, I really got into the details of what makes something canonical and went over the relevant biblical passages and the biblical history that led us to our understanding of the Bible that we have. But in this one, I'm going to kind of keep it, like I said, at the 30,000 foot view, give more of an overview, and talk about some of the major theological differences between the Protestants and the Catholics when it comes to this issue, just so that we don't get too repetitive. And like I said, the other presentation is out there for anyone who's interested. And then in our very last video, like I said, provided that all of this goes according to plan, we'll finally get around to answering the question of, are these books canonical and why, or why not? Alright, so with all of that being said, this video is just going to be on that first question: what is the Apocrypha? And in terms of the technical term itself as it's used in the discussion between Protestants and Catholics regarding what books are in the Bible, you can basically think of it as what the Catholics have minus what the Protestants have. That's a very basic idea of what it is. Catholics have bigger Bibles than us. The amount that it is bigger by, that's the Apocrypha. That's the basic idea. If we want to be a little bit more specific, we would say that it is the books and also parts of books that the Roman Catholics had, past tense, in their Bibles, which are now absent in Protestant Bibles. Why the whole past tense thing and now thing? Why am I bringing attention to those two things? And this has to do with the history of Protestantism and Catholicism. Catholicism actually didn't dogmatize their canon until after the Reformation was basically already underway. So a good many of the reformers had, for all intents and purposes, already broken off with the Roman Catholic Church at the point that the Roman Catholics decided to dogmatize which books were in their Bibles and which weren't. But there were some books that they had in their Bibles. That's not to say that they necessarily treated all of those books as canonical, but there were some books that they had, or parts of books that they had at the time, that were still in common use. Later on, they would dogmatize their canon. I think that was Council of Trent, 1544-ish, and a little after, I think. Don't quote me on that, but basically mid-1500s is when they got around to dogmatizing this. And what the Protestants had already identified as apocryphal by then didn't quite exactly match up what the Catholics decided to dogmatize. And these books, the Protestants actually originally printed in their Bibles for quite a while. Actually, we'll discuss that as well. But nowadays, most Protestants don't have them in their Bibles, at least in those places where the Protestants have been able to produce their own Bibles independent of other groups like the Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, etc. If you happen to be in a place that has very strong Catholic or especially Eastern Orthodox influence, the Bibles that you have available to you as a Protestant might be only Eastern Orthodox Bibles, for example, in which case you wouldn't see this difference. But especially in the West, and particularly in English-speaking countries, if you have a Protestant Bible, it's not going to have these parts in it. Like I said, old school Protestants, they actually had them in theirs, usually in its own section, but now they don't, and that difference would basically be what the Apocrypha is. If we want to be more specific about it, so we actually have some names to hang our hats on and actual pieces and parts to look at, it would basically be this. At the time that the Protestants were separating from the Roman Catholics, they knew that the Roman Catholics in general used these books and these parts of books, and the Protestants were saying that these books and parts of books were not reliable, that they should not be used as a source of dogma like all of the other books in the Bible. And so this included 1st and 2nd Esdras. And if I remember correctly, and I might be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, the Catholics actually later on at the Council of Trent I don't believe that they actually dogmatized 1st and 2nd Esdras. So the Protestants and the Catholics, I actually think, agree on that one. But 1st and 2nd Esdras, for those of you who don't know, which I'm going to assume is probably quite a few of you, that is part of the Ezra and Nehemiah corpus of literature. Ezra and Nehemiah would be in the Greek system, Esdras Beta. There's an Esdras Alpha, that's this first one here, called First Esdras. It's kind of like Ezra and Nehemiah, but not really. And then after Ezra and Nehemiah, there is another Esdras that is a lot of times referred to as 4th Esdras, and it just kind of goes off in its own place. It uses some of the same people, but doing some very different things. So yeah, Ezra and Nehemiah as we normally think of it, and then these two Esdrases, 1st and 2nd Esdras, depending on which system you're in. In the Protestant system, it's 1st and 2nd Esdras. In the Greek system, it's Esdras Alpha, and then an Esdras that the Greek system didn't have, but the Latinates and also some of the Asiatic systems did have the 4th Esdras. Like I said, it's a little complicated, but some works that were kind of like Ezra and Nehemiah, but beyond Ezra and Nehemiah. And like I said, I don't think the Roman Catholics wound up dogmatizing those. But there's also books like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus or Sirach, and then 1st and 2nd Maccabees. In those books, the Catholics do have in their Bibles, and they do have them canonical in their Bibles. And the term that the Catholics would use for these books are that they are Deuterocanon, second canon. That's what Deutero refers to, second of something. Like Deuteronomy is second law, Nami is law, so Deuteronomy is second law, Deuterocanon is second canon. So these are works that they were saying these also are canon. And like I said, they didn't dogmatize that until the Council of Trent. But all of these works, they would say, are canonical. And then we get into the parts of books that they would have in their Bibles that, at least nowadays, especially for those of the West, and particularly in English, we don't have in ours, for us Protestants. This would include the additions to Esther, which of course would be in the book of Esther. Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah are associated with Jeremiah as kind of parts of Jeremiah. There's the Song of the Three Hebrew Children, the story of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. Those are all associated with the book of Daniel. And then in the Psalms, there is the prayer of Manasseh. Now, the first few here, all the way down to Bel and the Dragon, those you can find in Roman Catholic Bibles today, and as far as I know, they are a dogmatic part of the Roman Catholic Bible, meaning that you have to treat them as canon. The prayer of Manasseh, though, is a little bit odd in that it's kind of like 1st and 2nd Esdras, as I understand it. Down here, there we go. And that I don't think that the Roman Catholics have actually dogmatized the prayer of Manasseh. You will find it in a lot of their material. You will find it in their compilations of the Psalms and whatnot in their Bibles, but I don't think it's actually considered a dogmatic part of the canon, if I remember right. But like I said, this distinction came before the Council of Trent was a thing, and that's why what was dogmatized at the Council of Trent versus what the Protestants call Apocrypha is a little bit different, because it was the books that the Roman Catholics were using at the time that the Protestants didn't agree with, and later on, when the Roman Catholics got down to hashing this out in the Council of Trent, it turns out that they kind of sort of agreed with the Protestants in a few cases, but by and large they disagreed with the Protestants. So Prayer of Manasseh, 1st and 2nd Esdras, usually wouldn't have great standing in the Roman Catholic Church, but the other books would be considered Deuterocanon, also canon, second canon. All right, so that is materially what is in the Apocrypha. When we're talking about it as a technical term, in the discussion between Roman Catholics and Protestants regarding what should be in the Bible, it's these books and these parts of books. But why the term Apocrypha? Why did Protestants use that word to describe these books? Well, that comes from an early church father by the name of Jerome. And some of you actually might already be familiar with this church father because he is the church father who is associated with the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible. that was kind of his baby, as it were. In his lifetime, he was tasked with basically producing a new translation of the Bible in Latin. Now, previous to his time, there had already been Latin translations that were done of the Bible, but they were usually kind of hodgepodge. This person over here decided to translate this book, maybe the Gospels, and this person over here decided to translate Isaiah, and a completely different person decided to translate the Psalms. And so they weren't very cohesive, and some of them were also not particularly accurate. And so Jerome's task was to come up with a more cohesive and more accurate Latin version that came to be called the Latin Vulgate. Now, unfortunately, he didn't actually complete that task. A lot of people think that he did, but he actually didn't. He translated a lot of works of the Bible into Latin, but he didn't actually finish. And some of the work that he did was actually based on some of those previous translations that I already referred to. He kind of used those as a basis in a lot of cases, amending them where they were deemed to be significantly inaccurate, but a lot of times his translation was very much so based on those earlier ones. So he kind of borrowed from earlier translations. He didn't finish all of them himself, and other people kind of came along after him and kind of patched things up and made some tweaks and changes. But still, most of the material did in fact come from Jerome. That part is still accurate. And so Jerome, of course, had to deal with this question of, what should be in the Bible and what shouldn't be, what should be most accurate, what shouldn't be. And when it came to the question of the Old Testament, Jerome actually traveled to Israel, and he learned from the Hebrews who were alive in his day what they considered to be canonical, and he used that as the basis for what he considered to be canonical in the Old Testament. And so after he had studied Hebrew with them, after he had learned their language and also had received manuscripts from them that would be representative of their Bible, which of course would not include the New Testament because the Hebrews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, but just the Old Testament works. After he had started to do this, he wrote the following. And this was in his prefaces to the books of the Vulgate, and specifically this is in his preface to the books of Samuel and Kings. Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel was sometimes just referred to as Samuel because it's the same book, just in 2 parts, 2 volumes, and the same thing with Kings. We consider it 1st and 2nd Kings, but it's really the same book, it's just 2 volumes. And that had to do with the fact that in the ancient world, you usually don't want to put too much material together in a book because it became really unwieldy at that point, especially in scroll form. If a scroll was too big, it was just too big. And so with books that were fairly large, they would usually split them into 2 or more smaller scrolls. And so Samuel, even though it was seen as one work, got split into 2 scrolls. Kings got split into 2 scrolls, but it was still just Samuel, still just Kings. But that's aside. So when he wrote the prefaces to these books, he said this: "This preface to the Old Testament scriptures may serve as a helmeted, that is, defensive or protective, introduction to all the books which we turn from Hebrew into Latin, so that we may be assured that what is outside of them must be placed aside among the apocryphal writings. Wisdom, therefore, which generally bears the name of Solomon, so Wisdom of Solomon, and the book of Jesus, the son of Sirach, and Judith, and Tobias, which is also Tobit, and the shepherd of Hermas are not in the canon. The first book of Maccabees is found in Hebrew, but the second is Greek, as can be proved from the very style." So Jerome is going through, and he's making these translations, and he's basically saying, I can find in the Hebrew, all these other works, but these ones I don't find in the Hebrew. And Maccabees, well, it's found in the Hebrew, but the second is Greek. And he's basically saying that these books are of a more dubious nature. And it's he that decided to call these books apocryphal. And like I said, Protestants, they're very interested in going back to the sources. That was one of the cries of the Protestant Reformation, was ad fontes, to the fount, to the source. And so they started looking back up, the ancient church fathers, and reading their works and going through them. And they get into Jerome's works, and they find that there is this group of books that Jerome doesn't trust And Jerome calls them Apocrypha. And the Protestants say, well, he's an early church father. He put a lot of time and research into this. If anyone's going to know, it's going to be him. And if he thinks that these books are dubious, then so are we. And we're going to call them what he called them. He called them apocryphal, so we're going to call them apocryphal. So that's where the term came from. The Protestants, they're looking back through early church history. They were looking specifically at Jerome because he was one of the major people who dealt with this whole issue of what belonged in the Bible and what didn't. And Jerome used the word apocrypha, apocryphal, and that's where the Protestants got the term from. The oddity about this, though, is that Jerome was weird. And this is where a lot of groups outside of Protestantism would see the Protestants' engagement with this issue as being less than full, we'll say, less than well-informed, historically speaking, because it turns out that Jerome was actually weird in this regard. That is, Jerome used the term Apocrypha to refer to these books, but most other early church fathers did not. He was definitely the oddball in this. In fact, when you look at the pre-Ephesian, and I'm talking about the Council of Ephesus, if you look at the church fathers who were pre-Ephesians, pre-Ephesus, and their use of that word, Apocrypha, they actually had a different set of books in mind than Jerome did. The only other church father that I have ever found who used that word the same way that Jerome did to refer to books like, Tobit and Judith and those books as Apocrypha, the only other church father I found that did that was Cyril of Jerusalem. And Cyril of Jerusalem was similar to Jerome in that he also studied in Israel. He's Cyril of Jerusalem, so that's kind of goes with it. He studied in Jerusalem in the 4th century. He was aware of what the Jews were using at that time, and that greatly influenced his view of what books should be in the Bible and what books shouldn't be. And he had a very, 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 very low of these other books like Judith and Tobit and all those ones. But it was just those two church fathers that referred to those books as Apocrypha. And the reason why I'm talking about this being pre-Ephesus, for those who don't know, some of you already know exactly where I'm going with this, but for those of you who don't know, the Council of Ephesus was a significant council in the early church because it is the first council that resulted in a permanent schism, at least so far, in what would be called Orthodox Christianity, or what we could term, loosely speaking, Orthodox Christianity. I'm not talking about Eastern Orthodox, I just mean Orthodox in the general sense. Now, there were schisms that happened before, but they weren't necessarily between Orthodox Christians. For example, the Gnostics were a heretical group that for which there was schism, in a sense, between themselves and the rest of Christians. But like I said, the Gnostics were not considered Orthodox. There was also the Montanists, but they were not generally considered Orthodox. There was the Donatists that split as well, but that schism was actually reconciled, so that wasn't permanent. Ephesus, the Council of Ephesus in the early 5th century, I think it was like 1430-ish, that council is the first one to result in a permanent schism among the Orthodox Christians. And so that is used as a time marker in a lot of these kinds of analyses, because basically Orthodox Christians were in agreement up until then. So if you want to get an idea of what was the consensus of the early church, you need to look pre-Ephesus, because after that you start getting into a lot of the factions, and things become kind of convoluted after that and very, very, very sectarian after that. So if you want an idea of what early Orthodox Christianity was like, you need to go pre-Ephesus. Not that other things that happen in history aren't relevant. They are, because they lead to where we are now. But in terms of getting an idea of what early Christians believed, you need to go pre-Ephesus, because that's the point where Orthodox Christians were united. But like I said, in this period that would be relevant, the only church fathers to use Apocrypha for these books and parts of books that we're considering was just Jerome and Cyril. and they used it because of their exposure to Hebrews in their time frame, who had a very particular set of books that they used, and they said, we need to go with what the Hebrews are using, and everything else, that would be associated with that, but is not that would be bad. It's Apocrypha. But like I said, they're the only ones that refer to those books that way. The rest of the church fathers used Apocrypha to refer to a different group of books. And the word Apocrypha, you do the etymology on it, and you find out that it actually basically means hidden or secret. And how it was used by most other church fathers was to refer to the hidden or secret works that a group called the Gnostics had. And calling the Gnostics a group is actually a little bit of a misnomer because they weren't terribly unified on many things. The Gnostics, there are lots of different kinds of Gnostics out there. Very, very, very diverse forms. You have some like the Manichaean Gnostics, whom Reformed Christians are often compared to, but if you know anything about Manichaean Gnosticism, you know that that's not a very valid comparison. Some people think that we're like them because the Manichaean Gnostics believed in things like predestination, and also that there was a group of the elect. However, their concept of who the elect are versus Reformed Protestants' view of the elect is very, very different. For the Manichaean Gnostics, the elect were the group of people who had the power to turn ordinary matter into celestial goo through digestion, we'll say, without getting too graphic about it. But yeah, basically what came out the south end was divine goo. And these were the people who were defined as the elect for the Manichaean Gnostics. Not exactly what the Reformed Protestants mean by elect. So yeah, we get compared to them sometimes, but it's not a very good comparison. So you get groups like that, and then you also have Gnostic groups like, say, the Marcionites, and their big thing that they're famous for in history was the fact that their leader, Marcion, basically came up with his own Bible, and it was a very short Bible. Basically, all the stuff in the Old Testament got nixed, got cut out, and there was also a lot of sections in the New Testament that he cut out as well. So they weren't terribly unified groups. You had some groups that were feeding the elect food and turning it into spirit goo, and you also got others that are over there with a pair of scissors and cutting up manuscripts. Not a terribly cohesive group, but that being said, whatever else they happened to believe, the Gnostics were generally united in saying that there were things that Jesus and the apostles taught openly and publicly, and there were some things that they taught secrets and they hid from the public view, and that the secret hidden things were only known to a select few and passed on by a select few. And so the writings that were unique to the Gnostics came to be known as secret writings, hidden writings, apocryphal writings. And that's how most of the church fathers in church history made use of the term Apocrypha. It was with regard to the writings of the Gnostics. That's how they used it. So you can find that kind of usage in the writings of Athanasius, and we're actually going to look at that in the writings of Rufinus. We're going to look at that, Augustine, Tertullian, Eusebius. There's others that you could look at, and we'll just go ahead and put it up here. I'm going to go ahead and give you references to the first ones I mentioned just so that you can look it up. We are going to go ahead and take a look at the first two. The others I would suggest that you go ahead and look at as well on your own time if you're interested. And if you want to just start reading through the church fathers, I mean, there's lots of material there. When it comes to the issue of the Apocrypha, you'll find that it's more than just these that I've listed. This is just a sampling to make the point. Most of the early church fathers use the Apocrypha, that term Apocrypha, in a very specific way to refer to Gnostic writings. The Gnostics believed in secret hidden knowledge, secret hidden writings, and the early church fathers used that word Apocrypha to refer to those Gnostic works. Most of them did not use the term Apocrypha to refer to works like Judith and Tobit and Sirach and those books that were basically publicly available in public common knowledge. The only church fathers to do that were Jerome and Cyril, and they did that because of their very low opinion of those books. They were basically saying that these books should be regarded just as lowly as we regard the books from the Gnostics. That's what Jerome and Cyril were saying, that these books are basically just as bad as those. Most other early church fathers, though, they didn't look at it that way. And to make that point, let's go ahead and first look at Athanasius, what he wrote. All right, so this quotation I broke into two parts so that it'd be more legible on the screen here. And this is in his 39th Festal letter, by the way. In his 39th Festal letter, which was written in 367 AD, Athanasius goes through and he gives an accounting of what he understands to be the biblical canon in his time. He was, for those of you who don't know, he was the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, which was a major, what is called see of Christianity, basically a place and source of great influence in early Christianity. There were a lot of major sees, 4 or 5 depending on what you count them, but there was Rome, which eventually that see would become the Roman Catholic Church as we know it today. There was also the see of Constantinople. That see, though, didn't develop until the 4th century when Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire there, so that was a relatively young see. And then there was also the sees of Alexandria, which Athanasius was a bishop of, and there were ones before him and ones after him. But Alexandria was a see of early Christianity. Jerusalem was a see of early Christianity. And then Antioch was the other major see of early Christianity. And Antioch and Constantinople were basically the ones that led to Eastern Orthodoxy. Alexandria and Jerusalem basically got taken over by the Muslims in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, and so they basically stopped being an influence. And like I said, Rome gave way to the modern Roman Catholic Church as we know it today. But in his 39th Festal letter, Athanasius goes through and he lists the books that he considers to be canonical in his day, and then after he goes through listing all those books, he says this: "But for greater exactness I add this also, writing of necessity, that there are other books besides these not indeed included in the canon, but appointed by the fathers to be read by those who newly join us." That is, these books are for proselytes, they are for catechumens, and who wish for instruction in the word of godliness, the wisdom of Solomon, and the wisdom of Sirach, and Esther, and Judith, and Tobit, and that which is called the teaching of the apostles, and the shepherd. And it's going to go on from here, but we'll go ahead and stop here and make the major point that I want to, and that is that Athanasius was very much so aware of these books, and he very much so believed that these books were not canon. He was very clear about the fact that these are not indeed included in the canon. He is very, very, very specific about that. But at the same time, he views these books as being beneficial. These are appointed by the fathers to be read by those who newly join us. That is, these books, while they're not canon, they are beneficial. And to put it in kind of a modern comparison, there's actually a lot of books like this that function this way for modern Protestants and evangelicals and Protestants and groups like that. In my own particular group, in the URCNA, there are a number of people who would say be familiar with R.C. Sproul's work and the work that is done by Ligonier Ministries that was associated with Sproul when he was alive. Of course, now, unfortunately, Sproul is dead, but Ligonier Ministries still continues, and a lot of the material that they put out, we also put out along with them. We don't put it out as if it was part of the Bible or something like that, but we say that there's lots of good information here and lots of good analyses of various topics that are relevant to general Christian living, even in our understanding of how we should do, interpretation and hermeneutics and these kinds of things. There's lots of useful information that Ligonier Ministries puts out that R.C. Sproul, when he was alive, that he put out. His books are still being read by a number of people and still being recommended by a number of people. The way that we use books like that now in the modern is basically how Athanasius was suggesting that these books be used in his own day. Okay, so these aren't in the canon, but these are good for people who newly join us, who need instruction in the word of godliness. So here's some extra reading for them to help them understand our basic worldview. The Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit, Teaching of the Apostles, the Shepherd. By the way, the teaching, well, Esther is going to be interesting in this too, but the Teaching of the Apostles isn't what in Protestants or the Roman Catholics would consider to be a part of the Apocrypha debate. But early on, it was something that was evidently read and was treated basically the same as these other books that did become a part of the Apocrypha. And the shepherd that Athanasius is referring to here is probably the shepherd of Hermas. When we look at Rufinus's writing, he'll also reference this. And with regard to the issue of Esther, it's interesting that Athanasius puts Esther with these extra works that are good for people to read who are new to join us, but he doesn't consider Esther to be canonical. And historically, he's not alone in that. There's actually a number of early church fathers and early Jewish sources, indeed, that also did not include Esther among the canonical works. That's interesting. We'll discuss more on that as we go forward. But like I said, my main point here is that Athanasius takes a look at these books and he doesn't call them Apocrypha like Jerome does. Instead, he says that these books are beneficial, they're appointed by the fathers to be read, and exactly what he means by appointed by the fathers to be read is a subject of some discussion. Some people think that it refers to the apostles themselves. Some people think that it refers to the generation right after the apostles that we usually call the apostolic fathers, so people like Papias and stuff like that, and Papias, Polycarp, those kinds of fellows. But in either case, Athanasius is either referring to basically the first generation of Christians or the second generation of Christians said that these writings, while they're not canonical, are good to read. That's Athanasius's understanding. And of course, Athanasius is writing this before Jerome did his analysis of the issue. All right, and then going on with the quote, this is still from Athanasius. He says, "But the former, my brethren, are included in the canon, these latter being merely read." That is ecclesiastical. They're used by the church. That is what ecclesia refers to. It's the church. These are used by the church, but they're not canon. We don't get dogma from them. Just like in the modern, we would read a lot of R.C. Sproul's works and say there's a lot of good, useful stuff in them, but we also wouldn't say that R.C. Sproul's works are scripture. They're not a source of dogma. When we say this is what we believe and we cite a source, we're not going to cite R.C. Sproul. We're going to cite something in the Protestant Bible. This is the same way that Athanasius envisions the use of these books. Okay, so these latter being merely read, that is ecclesiastical, used by the church, but not canon. And then he goes on to say, "Nor is there in any place a mention of apocryphal writings." Notice that Athanasius separates the works which are to be read, yet not canonical, from the apocryphal writings. Okay, he puts them in a completely different category. But they, he goes on to say, referring back to the apocryphal writings, are an invention of heretics who write them when they choose, bestowing upon them their approval and assigning to them a date, that so using them as ancient writings, they may find occasion to lead astray the simple. Okay, so what is it that Athanasius believes about the apocryphal writings, what he would call the Apocrypha? When he talked about apocryphal writings, he associated them with heretics who sought to lead astray the simple. Okay, that's not like Jerome. When Jerome used the term Apocrypha, he was using it to describe books like Wisdom and Tobit, those kinds of things that we already discussed. Athanasius, though, he's already discussed Wisdom and Tobit in those books, and he's talking about a different class of writings that are not to be used by the church at all in any positive way, because they're from heretics and they lead astray the simple. If you teach on these, you're not supposed to teach on them positively. The other books you can use positively, you just can't use them as if they were canon. These you cannot. You cannot use these positively in the church because they're from heretics and if taught positively, they could lead astray the simple. Okay, that's how most of the early church fathers used the term Apocrypha. Jerome and Cyril, they were oddballs. Okay, they used that term to refer to a group of books that the rest of the early church fathers didn't have that kind of animosity towards. Instead, what they had animosity towards was the writing of the heretics, the writings of the Gnostics in particular. The kinds of writings that were meant to lead astray the simple. Okay, the early church fathers, as a rule, excepting Jerome and Cyril, they would be the exception. Everybody else, they thought Apocrypha was a pejorative term and something that was the least reliable at all because it came from the dreaded Gnostics who were feeding the elites so that material could be turned into God goo. Apocrypha for most of the church fathers was a very strong pejorative, and they didn't use that word by and large for books like Tobit and Judith and Sirach and things like that. Instead of using the term that Jerome uses, which is not consistent with most of the other church fathers, I would suggest that the better term for us to use to have a more meaningful conversation about what's going on here is the term ecclesiastical. And this is not my term at all. This is actually from the church father Rufinus. So we'll go ahead and read his quote. And again, I did this in two parts so that it would be big enough for us to easily read on screen. But this is what the church father Rufinus says. And for those of you who don't know Rufinus was kind of known as the bridge between the East and the West. That is, he kind of traveled back and forth. He knew people on both sides and kind of tried to hold the two sides together. The two sides already had some major cultural differences in language. One side spoke Latin, the other side spoke Greek. And Rufinus was one of the guys who was trying to hold both sides of Christianity, as it were, together. And when this subject came up for him, this is what he had to say about it. He said, "But it should be known that there are also other books which our fathers called not canonical, but ecclesiastical." So he's already gone through, by the way, this is his commentary on the Apostles' Creed, given around the turn of the 4th century going into the 5th century. And he's already given a list of the books that he considers to be canonical. And then he says there's another class of books, too, that we need to consider. And he says these ones aren't canonical, but they're ecclesiastical. And this, of course, the English translation is ecclesiastical. But an inflected form of ecclesia is what Rufinus actually uses in his text. He is the one who coined this term, not me, not anyone else. This is Rufinus who uses this word that way. Okay, so these other books which our fathers called not canonical but ecclesiastical, that is to say, wisdom, called the Wisdom of Solomon, and another wisdom called the Wisdom of the son of Sirach, spelled a little differently, which being last mentioned, the Latins called by the general title Ecclesiasticus, designating not the author of the book but the character of the writing. To the same class belong the book of Tobit and the book of Judith and the books of the Maccabees. Let's just pause here for a second. So Rufinus, again, makes the same basic distinction that Athanasius did. We've already discussed the canonical works. These works are not those. Instead, these are in a separate category that our fathers gave us. Okay, exactly what the fathers refers to is a little bit debatable. Is he talking about the apostles? Is he talking about the first generation out from the apostles? Who exactly the fathers were is debatable, but like I said, it either goes back to basically the first or second generation of Christians. Most people who analyze this stuff are convinced of at least that much. So this goes way back in history, and these works are still beneficial for the church. They are ecclesiastical. They are church books. They are not canonical church books, but they are church books in the sense that there is value in them. And so he goes through and he lists a lot of the same books that Athanasius does. And he goes on to say that in the New Testament, so he gives the Old Testament ones first, and then he says in the New Testament, the little book which is called the Book of the Shepherd of Hermas, and that which is called the Two Ways, which would also be called the Didache, or the Teaching of the Apostles, or the Judgment of Peter, all of which they would have read in the churches, but not appealed to for the confirmation of doctrine. So he is saying, like Athanasius, that these are books that were given to us as useful books, informing us of a general worldview and informing us on subjects of godliness and right living, but we don't use them for doctrine. There's nothing dogmatic that can be said from them. They have use and utility, and none of that is dogmatic. And then after that, Rufinus goes on to say the other writings they have named Apocrypha. That is, those that are outside the aforementioned ecclesiastical writings. Those ones, okay, not the ecclesiastical writings, not the two ways, not the Shepherd of Hermas, not the judgment of Peter, not Tobit and Judith and those ones, anything that's outside of that group, so not in the canon, not in the ecclesiasticals, things that are outside of that, that's what's Apocrypha. And these they would not have read in the churches. Okay, the reason why these books were in use by the time that, the Protestant and Roman Catholic division happened in the early 1500s, early to mid 1500s, the reason why these books were in use is because basically it had been handed down to them to be used. And Rufinus and Athanasius kind of represent a middle ground on this. There are other church fathers that you would look at, which of course would be more extreme to one side or the other. We already mentioned Jerome and Sealer of Jerusalem, that they said, no, all of those books that come after the canonical books, all of those are apocryphal, all of those are bad, all of those are heretical, get rid of them all. Then you have people like Rufinus and Athanasius that are saying, maybe not get rid of them all. Some of them still have some general utility, even if we can't appeal to them for doctrine. That'd be Rufinus and Athanasius. And then you get people that, instead of saying they're useful, they said, no, they really are fully canonical, like Augustine, for example. Augustine, who writes latter 4th century and a lot in the 5th century, he was very adamant that these books were fully canonical, along with all the other books that we normally think of as canonical in the Old Testament. So there was actually a scattering of opinions on this. You had some people like Jerome and Cyril saying don't use them at all. You had some people like Augustine saying they are just as authoritative as everything else. They're good for dogma. And then you have people like Rufinus and Athanasius who are in the middle saying they're not canon, but they're also not apocrypha. That is, they're not to be rejected. They're in the middle. They're ecclesiastical. And I am going to use the term ecclesiastical to go along with this because I think it's more representative of the mainstream of early Christianity. And I would also say it's more in keeping with the mainstream of early Protestants as well. As an example of that, there's a few different examples you could look to, but as an example of that, let's look at the 1560 Geneva Bible's introduction to the Apocrypha. As I mentioned before, the Protestants actually had the Apocrypha in most of their Bibles early on. It wasn't until later, and we'll talk about this, but it wasn't until later that they started taking the Apocrypha out of their Bibles. Early on, though, they did have it in their Bibles. They just put it in a different section. There would be the Old Testament, and then the Apocrypha, and then the New Testament. And in that section that was labeled the Apocrypha, a lot of times they would have a foreword to the Apocrypha in which they basically laid out their view of the Apocrypha. In the 1560 Geneva Bible, this is what it says. It says, "These books that follow in order after the prophets," that is the Old Testament, "unto the New Testament," so between the Old Testament and the New Testament, "are called Apocrypha." They're just using Jerome's term, because like I said, that's what the Protestants did. They said, let's go back to the sources. Jerome is a source. He used the term Apocrypha, so we're going to use the term Apocrypha. These books are called the Apocrypha, that is, books which are not received by a common consent to be read and expounded publicly in the church, and neither yet serve to prove any point of Christian religion, save inasmuch as they had the consent of other Christian scriptures called canonical to confirm the same, or rather whereon they were grounded. So here you see them making the same basic distinction that Athanasius and Rufinus did in saying, whatever these books are, they're not canonical, you're not to get doctrine from them, these books cannot be used dogmatically. And also, if we look at Athanasius and Rufinus, what they said, these are church books. That's how Rufinus named them, was ecclesiastical. but he was very clear about the fact that these are not being expounded in the church as if they were canonical books. And that's basically the same thing that the early Protestants are saying here in the 1560 Geneva Bible. They're saying, we don't read these and expound these publicly in the church. In their context, that would be basically during a sermon. These are not ones that we preach sermons from. These are not things that we can consider to be dogmatic sources of dogma. So even though Rufinus and Athanasius said it a little bit differently, the basic idea is the same. Whatever these are, they're not canonical. They are not to be used as if they were canonical. They're not to be preached from like we preach from the canonical works. But the 1516 Geneva Bible goes on to say this: but as books proceeding from godly men, they were received to be read for the advancement and furtherance of the knowledge of the history of God's people and for the instruction of godly manners. That sounds a whole lot like what Rufinus said, and also what Athanasius said. These are to be read by people who newly join us, so that they may learn the ways of godliness, so that they may learn our history, etc., etc. Very similar. These apocryphal books declare that at all times God had an especial care of his church and left them not utterly destitute of teachers and means to confirm them in the hope of the promised Messiah. And they also witness that those calamities that God sent to his church were according to his providence, who had both threatened by his prophets and so brought it to pass for the destruction of their enemies and for the trial of his children. So the early Protestants, when they looked at these books, they said, okay, yeah, they're not canonical. We're not going to use them like the canonical works. These are not the works that we're going to be preaching our sermons from. We're not going to be publicly expounding them. But we do recognize that they do teach godly manners, and that they also, insomuch as they record history, that they do show God's care and providence regarding his church in history. And that the bad things that befell them because God said not to do these things and that there would be consequences. And lo and behold, these record some of those consequences. This shows God sending teachers to his people to try to bring them back. Sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully. But that God provided his church, his people, with guides. Even if it wasn't during the period of inscripturation, there were still guides and people who helped steer the church in the right way. And we would say the same today. Like I said, R.C. Sproul would be a good example of this. While he was alive, he's certainly not perfect, just like the books of the Apocrypha are not perfect, they're not inspired. And R.C. Sproul, he was not inspired. But his life does demonstrate God providing a teacher to his people that would help them know him better and more accurately. That is what typified R.C. Sproul's life. And I wouldn't personally agree with R.C. Sproul on everything that he believed, just like I wouldn't agree with the apocryphal books and every single thing that they teach. But in general, it does show God convicting the hearts and minds of men through other men. It shows his continued providence in history, his provision of teachers for his people, and it shows the hand of God in history in mighty, significant, and undeniable ways. So if the Protestants originally had a fairly positive attitude towards these books, how did they get removed, especially from the books in the West and especially from English-speaking Bibles? How did that happen? Well, that was the result of the Puritan movement and early missionary movements. As far as the Puritans were concerned, as the name implies, they wanted everything to be pure. And I appreciate much of what the Puritans did. And even though I have great respect for them, and a lot of us who are Reformed Protestants would have great respect for them, we would also recognize that there were certain areas in which the Puritans probably went too far. And one of the areas where they may have gone too far, we'll discuss this more as this series progresses, but one of the areas in which they probably went too far, I'm going to go ahead and say probably, was that they wanted to have a version of the Bible that didn't have the Apocrypha in it. Well, they're not canonical, so why do we have them in there? No, we want a pure Bible, a Bible that doesn't contain anything else except the inspired Word of God. And so in 1666, a version of the KJV was made specifically with them in mind that removed the Apocrypha. Before that, I cannot find any record, at least in English. Other groups, like I said, that can be a little bit different. But at least in English, I can't find any English Bibles that don't have the Apocrypha in them until 1666, when the Puritans asked for it. But like I said, the Puritans kind of went too far in a lot of things, and frankly, they weren't overly representative of a lot of early Protestants. Most other Protestants, especially as far as English-speaking countries are concerned, didn't get rid of the Apocrypha until 1826. In 1826, the British and Foreign Bible Society removed basically the funding for printing the Apocrypha in Bibles. And this was a part of one of the most significant periods of missionary work in Christian history. You already had the English Empire going out pretty much everywhere, and England was, as the old saying goes, there was that the sun never set on the English Empire. They had colonies all over the place. And that provided an easy access point for English-speaking missionaries to get into a wide variety of countries, either into those colonies themselves or into those countries that neighbored the British colonies. And, of course, they're going out and they're evangelizing all these places. But there is a little bit of a problem. One, they're going out to these places and they're saying, okay, this is the Word of God, except for the section in the middle that they thought was a little bit incongruous. And then there's also the problem of this section in the middle being actually fairly large and kind of heavy, and since you got to get to the age of printing by this time, it's also kind of expensive. And so the decision was made by the British and Foreign Bible Society to remove funding for printing of the Apocrypha. It's not doctrinally dogmatic. It can be confusing for people who are new to the faith to have a book that has both essential parts and non-essential parts. It's expensive and also makes the things heavier. And when you're shipping things around the world, you start counting pounds pretty quickly. Extra weight is not welcome. Extra reading was not always welcome. Having to explain some of these distinctions was not welcome. And so 1826 is where a lot of the other groups started taking the Apocrypha out of their Bibles. And this is just kind of a sidebar, but the Apocrypha actually did influence a lot of groups, like I said, up until 1826, including the Mormons. The book, the version of the Bible that the Mormons had access to, particularly Joseph Smith had access to, included the Apocrypha, and his religion started, according to them, 1820. How accurate that is debatable, but we'll be generous and we'll say that they started in 1820. And there were certain things that happened in the Apocrypha that Joseph Smith wound up including in the Book of Mormon. Now, of course, the LDS people, they would say that Joseph Smith didn't write the Book of Mormon, that it was a previously existing record that Joseph Smith found, and he was given the ability to translate, but he didn't come up with it himself. I don't believe that for a second. And part of the reason why I don't believe that, there's many reasons, but part of the reason for why I don't believe that is that parts from the Apocrypha, the Christian Apocrypha that was available to him in his time, we are very sure that he had access to Bibles that had the Apocrypha in it, because the separation didn't occur until 1826, and it wasn't instantaneous that they, it's not like they recalled all the Bibles that were out there and had them amended. So the Apocrypha was present in a lot of Protestant Bibles for a very long time after that even. We're very sure that he had access to this material, and material that is very similar to the Apocrypha winds up in the Book of Mormon. It's hard to believe that that is just accidental. It seems a lot more likely that Joseph Smith plagiarized it. But that is a whole other discussion in and of itself, so we won't go down that rabbit trail too far. But the point here that I'm trying to get across in this first video is fairly simple. tried to tell you what the Apocrypha is, and we went over the specific books and parts of books that entails. We also talk about where the term came from. It came from Jerome, and I've also really tried to emphasize here that Jerome and Cyril were both weird relative to other early Christians. Other early Christians did not use that term of those books. Those books were the ecclesiasticals to most other church fathers. Okay, and because of that, if we're going to deal with the history in a meaningful way and be able to interact with Roman Catholics or even Eastern Orthodox or people like that who would disagree with the Protestant canon, we need to understand their history accurately and title them accurately. And frankly, Jerome and Cyril are not representative of the whole. People like Rufinus and Athanasius are. And so instead of using the term Apocrypha in this presentation, I'm going to use the term ecclesiastical. And ecclesiastical is a little bit broader category, because you saw in Athanasius and in Rufinus that they talked about not just Old Testament books or books associated with the Old Testament like Judith and Tobit and those, but they also talked about works associated with the New Testament like the teaching of the apostles or the Shepherd of Hermas and the judgment of Peter and things like that. Ecclesiastical is a little bit broader category of books that have basically been used by the church through history. And we want to give an apologetic for the Protestant canon, and an apologetic, for those of you who don't know, doesn't mean you're apologizing, it means that you're explaining something. That's what an apologetic is an explanation. And we want an explanation that is going to be robust. And so instead of limiting it down to just those books that the Roman Catholics had at the time of the Protestant Reformation, we're going to expand it out to a lot of the books, to basically all the books that were historically used by the church that would be beyond the Protestant canon. So we're going to not only answer that specific question of the Apocrypha, but we're going to answer the question of, the Shepherd of Hermas and all those other ones that I mentioned that were associated with the New Testament, as well as some that are associated with the Old Testament that we haven't got to yet. All right, so that is the conclusion of part 1. We're going to go ahead and stop here before getting into part 2. In fact, I actually haven't made all the slides for part 2 yet, so kind of have to stop here. But next time, we're going to talk about poor reasons to reject the ecclesiasticals. And remember, ecclesiasticals includes the Apocrypha, but it includes other works as well. And we're doing that so that we are dealing with the history appropriately, and so that we have a robust apologetic that allows us to answer all of these kinds of questions, not just the Apocrypha issue alone. We're going to broaden it out, and we're going to take a look at the whole. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know him and to submit to him, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.